Elias Booker had been planning to close the garage early that night. The kind of quiet Tuesday where even the cold felt routine and the only sound was the compressor winding down. Then he heard shouting from the lot out front, and when he stepped outside, he saw an old man knocked to the ground, 3 men standing over him, and not a single person on the street willing to stop. Nobody wanted trouble. Nobody wanted to get involved. But Elias Booker was not built that way. He stepped out, put himself between the old man and the 3 strangers, and sent them walking, not knowing he had just touched the outer edge of a billion-dollar secret. By the following dawn, 12 black SUVs were parked outside his house. And when the woman who stepped out of the lead vehicle identified herself as a CEO, Elias understood the old man was no ordinary stranger. The garage had no pretension about it. A faded sign, a pair of hydraulic lifts, a workbench so worn its surface had absorbed 2 decades of grease and effort. Booker's auto sat at the edge of a county road outside Nashville, Tennessee, the kind of shop that survives on reputation rather than foot traffic, where the same cracked coffee mug had lived beside the same socket set for years without anyone moving either. Elias had built it deliberately. Competence over volume, thorough work and no shortcuts, customers sent away with repairs they hadn't expected to trust, but invariably did. He was 37 years old, lean in the particular way of men who work with their hands, and he had long since stopped expecting life to be generous to him. What he had made. What he kept, he had earned. On the workbench, between the socket set and the coffee mug, sat a small plastic-framed photograph. A girl of 10 in her school uniform, smiling with the particular brightness of someone who has not yet learned what difficulty feels like. Naomi. Elias checked his phone at 5 o'clock every single afternoon, not to answer messages, not to read anything, but to receive the single text from Mrs. Paulette next door, confirming his daughter had arrived safely and that dinner was in the oven. That text was the one appointment he kept without exception. Everything else could wait, be rescheduled, or go undone. That one could not. His history was not something he explained to customers, and he rarely explained it to anyone. He had spent 8 years as a mechanical engineer at a large industrial firm that manufactured braking systems for commercial transport equipment. Good work, the kind that demanded precision and carried real consequences when done poorly. He had been good at it. Then he had been too good, in the wrong direction. He discovered a structural flaw in a brake assembly that had already reached production, filed the formal report, and waited. What followed was not a correction but a reassignment of blame. The firm's legal team moved quickly. The internal review went the direction that protected the most senior names, and Elias Booker emerged as the engineer who had approved a dangerous component. He had not approved it. He had flagged it. That distinction was expensive to defend and easy to obscure, and he had not had the resources to fight what arrived next. He lost the position, then the certifications that depended on clean employment record, then most of what he had built in his 30s. He did not talk about this. He had chosen instead to open the garage, work clean, and live in a way that required no one to take his word for anything. The shop suited him that way. It was honest about what it was, and it asked of him only what he could genuinely give. He had stopped needing more than that. That Tuesday evening in late November, the air sharp with the first real cold of the season, Elias had just set down his wrench and was moving toward the roll-door panel when the sound came from outside. Not a crash, not a scream, but a sharp male voice ordering someone not to move, followed immediately by what was unmistakably the sound of a body going down on concrete. The man on the ground was old, 75, perhaps older, wearing a canvas jacket that offered almost nothing against the November cold, his white hair unkempt, his hands gripping a worn cloth bag with a resolve that was the first thing about him that Elias registered. 3 men stood arranged around him in the deliberate formation of people who have done this before. One blocking the roadside, one with a hand on the bag, and one to the right holding a phone at waist height, camera forward, recording. The old man was not screaming. He was speaking in a controlled, low voice, telling them they had no legal authority over anything in that bag, and his composure, in the cold, on the ground, outnumbered, was remarkable. Elias walked out without announcing himself and said, in a voice that carried without being raised, that they had about 15 seconds to get off private property. The man gripping the bag turned around, broad-shouldered, mid-30s, with the flat expression of someone employed rather than personally invested, a man named Dane Rourke, though Elias did not know that yet. Rourke looked at him the way certain people look at anyone they have already categorized, a mechanic, a nobody, a person whose presence registered as inconvenience rather than threat. He said, with a curl of amusement, that this was a private matter between the old man and his employers, and Elias would do well to go back inside and mind the kind of business that belonged to a man with grease under his fingernails. Elias did not raise his voice. He pointed to the wide-angle camera mounted above the garage bay, installed after a parts theft 2 years earlier, and said the feed was recording to an off-site server, that he could read the license plate on their vehicle from where he was standing, and that he had already placed a call to county dispatch. All of this was partially true. He was dialing as he spoke. The three men exchanged a look that was shorter than a full decision and longer than an instinct, and after a moment holding the particular tension of men calculating odds, Rourke released the bag, gestured to the others, and walked toward the parked sedan at the far end of the lot. Before he got in, he looked back at Elias with an expression that was not anger but something quieter and more purposeful. "You just saved the wrong person. You'll understand that soon enough." The old man was on one knee, still gripping the bag. Elias helped him to his feet without asking permission and guided him through the side door into the waiting area. 2 plastic chairs, a standing heater, and a coffee maker that produced results approximately as good as it looked. He sat the man down closest to the heater, poured a cup without asking, and set it on the end table without commentary. The old man looked at him the way people sometimes receive unexpected small kindness, a little suspicious, a little moved, working hard not to show either. His name, he said after a moment, was Harold. Harold's eyes moved around the garage with a deliberateness that was not confusion but assessment. He paused on the engine assembly at the secondary bench, a mid-century flathead diesel, the kind not seen in commercial service for 40 years, and asked, with precise technical vocabulary, whether the intake timing had been recalibrated for the fuel mix or retained from the original specification. Elias looked at him for a long moment. He said he had gone custom and left it at that. Harold nodded once, as if the answer confirmed something he had already suspected. Then, quietly, and without apparent address to anyone in the room, he said, "Some men spend their entire lives building an empire, then find themselves hunted by the very blood they trusted to carry it forward." Elias offered to call a shelter or the non-emergency line, or both. Harold refused each with the calm precision of someone who had thought through these options and reached conclusions. He said there were people in the local system who had already been made aware of his movements, perhaps through financial channels, perhaps through direct contact, and that presenting himself at any official location before he was ready would end things badly and quickly. Elias was not ready to accept all of it, but he was willing to accept that the man in front of him was genuinely afraid of something real. The performance of fear and the reality of it looked different. Harold was not performing. From the cloth bag, Harold withdrew a pocket watch. It was old, not antique store old, but genuinely aged, its gold casing worn smooth at the edges in the way of objects carried every day for many years. Engraved on the cover was a letter-formed W, intertwined with a hawk in full flight. Elias didn't recognize the symbol, but he felt the weight of the object in the way you feel the weight of something that has been important to someone for a very long time. Harold held it briefly, then set it on the end table between them without explanation. He asked if he could stay in the waiting room through the night. Elias considered this with the particular slowness of a man who had a daughter sleeping a quarter-mile away and did not take chances with her safety. He said Harold could stay in the waiting room, that the side door would be locked from inside, and that Elias would be at the workbench nearby. Harold accepted these terms without negotiation, settled into the chair with the deliberate care of someone whose body had been carrying too much for too long, and within a few minutes was asleep, or appeared to be. Sometime after midnight, while Elias was working through parts inventory at the bench, he heard the old man murmur. 2 names, Victoria, then Preston, then a phrase half-formed and low, something about a trust, something about an amendment, the word dominion spoken with the weight of a proper noun, carrying the history of something large and old. Elias wrote nothing down. He had learned to wait before reacting to things he didn't yet understand. Just before 2 in the morning, he noticed a dark sedan parked across the road. A figure raised a phone toward the garage for several seconds, then drove away without hurrying. When Elias returned to the waiting room at 4:30, the chair was empty. Harold was gone. The coffee cup had been rinsed and set upside down by the sink. On the end table, where the man had been, sat the pocket watch and a small square of paper torn from the back of a parts catalog. In handwriting that was precise and unhurried, it read, "Do not trust the first person who comes looking for me." Elias drove home in the charcoal pre-dawn, parked in his driveway, and sat in the cab of the truck for a few minutes, running through the night with the discipline of a man who knows that trying to solve incomplete problems is how you make mistakes. He had an old man, 3 men who wanted something from him, a pocket watch with a symbol he didn't recognize, and a warning on a torn scrap of paper. He brought the watch inside, set it on the kitchen counter, started the coffee, and decided to let it sit until something clarified itself. The clarification arrived 40 minutes later, in the form of sound. A low engine note that was not the county road's usual morning traffic, then another, then several more, a rolling sequence that did not sound like coincidence. He stepped to the front window and counted 12 black SUVs moving with the coordinated discipline of a security detail, filling the short street in both directions with a quiet finality that left no ambiguity about who they had come for. The windows were uniformly dark. The vehicles sat running, exhaust rising in the cold morning air, and the men who stepped out were dressed alike. Dark suits, earpieces, the still attentiveness of people paid to wait and act on instruction. Elias checked the hallway. Naomi's door was closed, the small nightlight still glowing at the baseboard. He called Mrs. Paulette, spoke quietly for 30 seconds, and watched through the side window as his daughter's silhouette appeared at the back door with her bag over one arm and moved without protest through the shared hedge to the neighbor's kitchen. He exhaled once, then went to the front door. The woman who walked toward him from the center vehicle was in her early 40s, wearing a charcoal coat over a suit that had not been slept in, with the posture of someone who had spent decades walking into rooms that required it. Her face was composed, but not rested, a specific exhaustion around her eyes that suggested several days without adequate sleep and an intelligence working at full capacity through all of them. She stopped at the foot of his porch steps and looked at him the way someone looks at a person they have already researched and found legible, but not entirely predictable. She said, "I'm looking for Harold Whitcomb. I have reason to believe he was here last night." Elias did not answer immediately. He remembered the note. He was looking at a woman who had arrived with 12 vehicles and a degree of precision that made clear this response had not been assembled in the previous hour. He said, "If you came here to threaten a mechanic, you brought a lot of cars." She didn't react to that. She produced a business card and held it toward him. The card read Victoria Whitcomb Ashford, Chief Executive Officer, Whitcomb Dominion Industries. She said Harold was her grandfather. He had been missing for 3 weeks. If Elias had helped him the previous night, then the life of a 78-year-old man and the future of a company were, at this moment, partially dependent on what he said next. He took the card. He stepped back. He said she had better come inside. When he set the pocket watch on the kitchen table between them, Victoria Whitcomb Ashford went very still. She looked at it for a long moment before she spoke. "He only gives that to someone he trusts with his life," she said quietly. "He has given it to exactly 2 people in 60 years. I am the other one." Victoria did not describe the Whitcomb family situation the way someone seeking sympathy describes their problems. She described it the way a CEO presents a risk analysis, efficiently, with clear causal chains and named actors. Harold Whitcomb had founded Dominion in the 1970s from a 2-truck freight operation in eastern Tennessee. The company had grown through energy infrastructure, logistics, and industrial transport into one of the largest private conglomerates in the southeastern United States, holding assets currently valued at approximately $42 billion. Harold had stepped back from daily operations 12 years ago, but retained ultimate control through a family trust specifically structured to prevent dilution of his founding authority. The arrangement had held for years. It stopped holding when Preston Ashford began quietly building a coalition within the board to have Harold declared mentally incapacitated. Preston was Harold's nephew by marriage, positioned over a generation of proximity and careful relationship management into the role of acting chairman during Harold's semi-retirement. 3 weeks before, Harold had discovered alterations in the trust documentation, not original filings, but amendments filed through a subsidiary legal entity that most of the board had never seen. The alterations were designed to route emergency voting authority to Preston in the event Harold was declared unable to exercise judgment. Harold had confronted no one. He had simply disappeared, taking with him the only physical copies of documents capable of proving the alterations were fraudulent. The men who had confronted Harold outside the garage were employed, through 3 layers of corporate separation, by Preston's private security operation. Their objective had not been robbery. It had been documentation. They needed footage of Harold behaving erratically, evidence they could present to the board as corroboration of his diminished capacity. The cloth bag had contained files Harold had been carrying, and the 3 men had needed either those files or the footage, preferably both. Elias listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "Why can't the CEO of a $40 billion company protect her own grandfather?" Victoria held his gaze and said, "Because the man doing this has been inside the house for 20 years. You don't see that kind of betrayal from the outside, and by the time you do, everyone whose loyalty you would call on has already been reached first." Elias looked at the table. He understood that particular dynamic in ways she could not know. She offered compensation for information. The offer landed on Elias the way such offers always did, not offensively, but without purchase. He said he didn't want money. He said, "If I help, it's not for what you can give me. It's because an old man was scared and ended up on the ground outside my garage, and nobody else stopped." Victoria looked at him for a moment with an expression that was harder to categorize. Not gratitude exactly, but the recognition of something unexpected. She had arrived with leverage and resources, and she had found a man immune to both. She would understand later that this made him the only person in the entire situation she could actually trust. It was Elias who thought to examine the watch itself. He turned it in his hands with the attention of someone who has spent years understanding how mechanisms conceal things inside other mechanisms, and within a few minutes he found it. The rear cover had been reseated with a tolerance too precise for its era. visible only to someone familiar with hardware of that period. He opened it with a dental pick from the bench and found, fitted flush against the movement's caseback, a piece of metal foil no larger than a fingernail, etched with a set of coordinates. Victoria stared at it. She said her security team had held the watch briefly during the search and found nothing. Elias said, "Harold didn't hide this in a phone. He hid it in something people would look at and assume they already understood." The coordinates resolved to an abandoned warehouse on the outer edge of the county. Formerly a Whitcomb Dominion regional freight hub, decommissioned 8 years prior and never transferred out of the family's holding company. Victoria wanted to move the full security detail. Elias recommended against it strongly. If Preston had surveillance on Victoria's movements, which was almost certain, 12 vehicles arriving at a dark warehouse in the pre-dawn would precede them as signal by several hours. They would go in Elias's truck. Victoria's most trusted security officer, a man named Graham Hollis, would ride in back. The drive moved through landscape Elias knew by feel rather than by name. He said almost nothing. Victoria said more than she intended, in the way of people under extended pressure who find themselves in a vehicle with someone who requires nothing of them. She talked about Harold. Not the founder, but the man, the way he had built the company's first service garage himself one Saturday because he couldn't yet afford to hire anyone, the way he had eaten lunch with the loading crews for 30 years. Elias listened and did not offer anything in return. He had learned to receive without feeling obligated to match. The warehouse was cold and unlocked, meaning someone had been there recently or was expected back. Inside, under a dropped ceiling panel near the dock office, a prescription bottle, a fold of thermal blanket, and a black and white photograph of a much younger Harold Whitcomb standing before 2 freight trucks. On the back of the photograph, in the same unhurried hand as the garage note, a single name, Marianne Bellamy. On the return drive, Graham mentioned the headlights that had appeared in the mirrors 3 minutes out and held distance for the rest of the route. Someone already knew they had been there. Marianne Bellamy lived in a narrow Victorian house 4 towns over, curtains drawn in midday, the doorbell disconnected by apparent choice. She had been Harold Whitcomb's private legal counsel for 31 years. When she opened the door and saw Victoria, she began to close it again. It was only when Elias held up the pocket watch that she stopped. She looked at his face, not his credentials, not his connection to the family, but his face, and then stood aside and let him in. She said she had been waiting for someone Harold trusted to find their way to her. She had not expected that person to be a mechanic from Burnside County. The information Marianne held was this: Harold had prepared a final amendment to the Dominion Trust, a document she had drafted at his instruction and held under separate seal. The amendment contained a provision that required Harold to appear in person before a board quorum within a defined time window to confirm his own capacity. In the event, he was reported missing under circumstances suggesting coercion. Without that confirmation, voting authority suspended entirely. It did not transfer to Preston, it simply halted. The window was closing. The full board meeting had been called for noon that same day. If Harold did not appear and speak for himself before the vote, the suspension clause would lapse, Preston's motion would carry, and the amendment would be rendered irrelevant. Then Marianne told Elias something she had told no one. Among the documents Harold had been quietly researching through private channels was the record of a brake assembly dispute at a firm called Carver-Macon Industrial, a firm that had held a subcontract relationship with Whitcomb Dominion during its infrastructure expansion years. Harold had reviewed the internal correspondence. He knew the engineer who filed the safety report had been deliberately repositioned as the liable party. He had known the name Elias Booker for some time. He had been preparing to act on what he knew. The evidence he had been carrying in the cloth bag included a copy of the original Carver-Macon internal correspondence. The correspondence that would prove the reassignment of blame had been coordinated through Preston's procurement network. The bag was gone. Rourke had it. The phone on Marianne's desk rang. She answered, listened 4 seconds, and set it down. The voice on the line had said, "If Victoria brings the old man to the board, none of them will leave the morning intact." By 8 o'clock that morning, Preston Ashford was on a prepared media call, speaking with the measured grief of a man who loved his family and found himself painfully concerned about an opportunist who had inserted himself into a private family situation. He named Elias Booker as a mechanic from rural Tennessee who had made contact with an elderly, confused man and was now working in coordination with Victoria Whitcomb Ashford to obstruct legitimate board proceedings. He used the word manipulated 7 times in 9 minutes. It was a professional performance, controlled, sympathetic, internally consistent, and designed to run in the window between the current moment and noon. By 8:40, the business press had the statement. By 9, 3 of Elias's repair appointments had canceled. His phone accumulated voicemails across a range from curious to threatening, and when someone posted the garage address in connection with the story, the character of those messages changed. Elias listened to 2 of them and stopped. Victoria found him in the kitchen. She said she was sorry, that she had not anticipated Preston moving this fast on the public side, and that she understood if Elias wanted no further part of it. He looked at her steadily. He said, "I already know what it looks like when someone uses a story to bury a person who can't afford to defend themselves. I've been on the inside of that. It doesn't scare me. It makes me careful." He told her, briefly and without performance, about Carver-Macon, the brake assembly, the report. The 8 years since. Victoria listened, and near the end of what he said, something shifted in her expression. Not pity, but recognition. She said, "The Carver-Macon subcontract ran through Preston's procurement division. He didn't engineer what happened to you directly, but he had every reason to make sure it stayed buried." Elias stood at the window for a long moment. He thought about what Harold had said in the garage the first night, about men who build empires and get hunted by their own blood. He thought about where a man like Harold would go when he needed to be somewhere that mattered, somewhere that held the memory of beginning before everything became complicated. Not a safe house, not a hotel. Somewhere that belonged to the story before the story became a legend. He said, "The original Whitcomb freight yard. The first one from when the company started. Where is it?" Graham reached for his phone. The original Whitcomb freight yard sat in a town called Crestfield, 40 miles southeast. A low cinderblock building with a corrugated metal roof. The company's original signage still bolted above the loading bay in letters 2 feet high, the green paint gone to verdigris and rust. The company had preserved it as heritage rather than for any operational purpose. It appeared in the company's anniversary materials and nowhere else, which meant it appeared nowhere that Preston would think to look, because Preston's frame of reference had never included the point before the money arrived. Harold was in the second-floor office, sitting in a wooden chair beside a window with the particular stillness of a man who has made peace with waiting. He was wearing the same thin jacket. When the door opened and he saw Victoria, his face moved through several expressions rapidly. Relief, emotion held firmly in check, and then the composure of a man who does not intend to be undone by his own feelings in front of an audience. He looked at Elias for a long moment. Then he said, "I wondered if you'd figure it out." Elias said, "You left enough." Harold said, "I left exactly what someone with your mind needed." Harold explained, without decoration, why he had chosen Elias in the parking lot that night. It had not been random. He had watched the entire exchange with Rourke from the ground. How Elias handled a threatening situation without resorting to it himself. How he protected a stranger without asking a single question about who that stranger was. how he turned down Rourke's implicit offer of easy non-involvement. Harold had been evaluating people for 60 years. He knew what he was looking at. He knew he was looking at a man who had been hurt by a corrupt system and had not let it make him corrupt. He confirmed that the cloth bag had contained copies of the Preston correspondence, the Carver-Macon files, and 2 affidavits from board members who had been coerced. The originals were distributed in places Preston would not find because Preston had never understood that the most durable storage is built before you know you will need it. He gestured toward the old freight management console in the corner, a late-model 1980s proprietary network terminal, running on hardware no modern intrusion tool was calibrated to reach. He had loaded files onto its internal storage 17 years prior and had never removed them. He believed they were still there, but the mechanical restart sequence required assistance he was no longer physically capable of providing alone. Elias was already at the panel. The restart required 22 minutes of the kind of diagnostic patience that belongs to people who have spent years learning to listen to machines rather than force them. He worked through the cold start sequence methodically, reading resistance in the connection points, coaxing a reluctant system back to function through attention rather than pressure. The terminal came live. The directory was there, dated 16 years prior. Internal correspondence between Preston's procurement entity and Carver-Macon's senior management. A contract with Rourke's security consultancy predating the current events by 3 years. A psychological evaluation marked with a fabrication notation in Harold's own hand, and a 64-page document simply titled Dominion Trust, Chain of Custody Review. They were mid-transfer when the sound arrived from below, gravel under tires, doors, and Rourke's voice giving instructions. Graham moved toward the stairs. Elias stopped him with one hand on his arm. He said, "They want the files. If we fight our way out, we lose time we don't have, and we draw the kind of attention that makes noon impossible. We need to be at that building in 90 minutes." He had studied the building's layout with the automatic attention of someone who never walks into a structure without understanding how it works. There was a secondary loading corridor running the full length of the east wall, used for vehicle positioning in the original freight operation, terminating at a roll door mounted on a manual crank mechanism. The roll door's exterior opened onto an equipment lot, separated from the main drive by a cinder block partition. They would not be visible from the front. He led them down the corridor in single file, Harold between Victoria and Graham, moving with the unhurried speed of someone who understands the difference between urgency and haste. At the roll door, he worked the crank mechanism with the practiced economy of a man who knows exactly what a mechanism requires. The door rose with a sound like a slow exhale. The equipment lot was empty. The partition wall blocked their line of sight to the front, and Rourke's line of sight to them. Before leaving, Elias shorted a connection at the secondary electrical panel, triggering the building's original industrial alarm, a system that produced an enormous amount of noise and drew everyone toward the main entrance. They were on the access road before the response from inside had become coordinated. The files had transferred before they left the office to a secured account Elias had used for years, its name drawn from something small and personal. The same hawk his daughter had named a stuffed animal at age 4, a name he had used as a password anchor ever since, without intending it to matter to anyone else. Caleb Strickland's cruiser was positioned at the tinner section half a mile out, blue lights passive but placed to require them to stop. Strickland had known Elias for 11 years. He had also received, in the previous 40 minutes, a formal request from a corporate legal team to detain a vehicle matching this description on elder exploitation grounds. He looked at the truck's occupants. Harold Whitcomb, alert and visibly irritated at the delay. Victoria composed, Graham expressionless. He looked at Elias. He said, "Tell me what I'm looking at." Elias played him the recording from the garage the previous night. Rourke's voice, clear and unmistakable, instructing Harold to sign or lose the ability to. Strickland listened to it once, stepped back from the intersection and said, "You've got a clock. Go." The Whitcomb Dominion headquarters occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower in downtown Nashville, the kind of building that announces itself without apology. The executive boardroom was on the 38th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows along the south wall, a table long enough to seat 24. 14 board members were present. Preston Ashford was at the head of the table, composed in the way of someone who has prepared extensively for an outcome and is watching it arrive on schedule. His legal counsel was beside him. A court-appointed evaluator sat ready to formalize the incapacity finding once the vote concluded. Preston had been speaking for 6 minutes about the difficulty of the situation, about his profound respect for Harold's legacy, about the unfortunate pattern of events that had made this moment necessary. He was performing grief with the technical proficiency of someone who had rehearsed it. Several board members were nodding. The door opened. Victoria walked in first. Harold Whitcomb walked in behind her. The board member at the far end of the table, a woman who had worked with the company since Harold's active years, stood up without appearing to decide to. The rest of the room processed what it was seeing with varying speed. Preston processed it instantly. His face moved through 3 expressions in under 2 seconds and settled into a controlled neutrality that cost him visible effort. Harold sat at the far end of the table, not at the head, not in Preston's seat, but in a chair that had been his original position for 30 years. He did not speak immediately. He let the room absorb him. Preston recovered. He said, with measured concern, that he was relieved Harold was present, that he had been genuinely worried, but that the question before the board remained Harold's cognitive state, and that the presence of an outside party, he indicated Elias near the door, suggested exactly the kind of undue influence they had been discussing. He said the board owed it to the company's stakeholders to proceed with the independent evaluation already arranged. Elias walked to the table and set the pocket watch in the center of it. He did not raise his voice. He said, "A man doesn't need authority to tell the truth. He only needs evidence." Marianne Bellamy entered from the secondary door with a sealed document envelope and a tablet. She announced the existence of the trust amendment, read the operative provision aloud, and confirmed that Harold's in-person appearance satisfied the confirmation requirement under that clause. Harold then addressed the board, clearly, specifically, and at length, confirming his capacity without ambiguity, identifying the trust alterations as fraudulent, and asking the board to direct their attention to the file currently transmitting to each member's secure terminal. The file appeared on the screens mounted along the table's length. The board read in a silence that was different on different faces, recognition on some, genuine shock on others, and on one member who had voted twice in Preston's direction on preliminary procedural motions, the specific expression of someone understanding the scope of a mistake while it is still in progress. The file documented the contract with Rourke's security firm dated 37 months prior, predating the current crisis by years, the falsified psychological evaluation with Harold's own notation flagging it. The fabricated board correspondence. The coerced affidavits from 2 members who had since formally recanted, and the original Carver-Macon documentation. The internal communication chain showing that a safety report filed in good faith by an engineer named Elias Booker had been deliberately reclassified through Preston's procurement network to transfer liability away from senior management. Victoria moved formally, in her capacity as CEO, to suspend Preston Ashford from all board functions pending external investigation, to refer the full file to the relevant regulatory authorities, and to direct the company's communications team to issue an immediate public correction regarding the characterization of Elias Booker that Preston's people had distributed through media channels earlier that morning. Each motion carried. Preston's counsel attempted to interject twice. Harold looked at him both times without speaking. When security arrived at Preston's elbow, he stood, straightened his jacket, and looked at Elias with an expression that had shed its composure entirely. He said quietly, close enough that only the nearest seats caught it, that a mechanic had no business standing in a room like this. Elias said, "I'm not trying to be in a room like this. I just needed to make sure you couldn't drag anyone else to the ground outside a garage." Harold's statement to the board concluded with a sentence entered into the official meeting record. Elias Booker came to the aid of an old man because it was the right thing to do. In doing so, he prevented the theft of everything I built over 60 years. This company owes him a debt it did not expect to carry and does not intend to forget. An hour after the meeting, Victoria found Elias on the building's rooftop terrace, a narrow platform above the mechanical level where the city spread below in the clear December afternoon, cold and bright. She had changed at some point and looked, for the first time since he had met her, like a person who had fully exhaled. She thanked him without preface. He said he didn't need thanks. She said she understood that, and she was doing it anyway. She had 3 things to say, she told him, and none of them were conditional. First, Whitcomb Dominion would file a formal correction with every entity that had received the morning's media statement and would enter the Carver-Macon findings into the public record. Second, the company would provide financial restitution for the professional losses Elias had sustained as a result of the falsified liability assignment, assessed independently but substantial. Third, she was offering him the directorship of a new safety and accountability division within the company, built on a single premise: any employee, engineer, driver, dock worker, or technician who identified a legitimate safety risk would have a formalized, protected channel to report it, and a team whose sole responsibility was to take that report seriously. Elias was quiet. He looked at the city below. He said he wasn't going to leave the garage. She said the division could be headquartered in his county and built from whatever structure he thought appropriate, including the existing facility if he wanted. He said, "If I say no to the third one, do I still get the first 2? She held his gaze without hesitation. She said yes, because it was right, not because it was a condition of exchange. He looked back at the city. He said he would think about the third one. Harold came through the roof door behind them with 2 cups of coffee, handed one to each of them, and looked out at the view with the serenity of a man returned to something he was not certain he would see again. He said, "The people I trusted most when I was building this company were the ones who had been burned and hadn't let it make them small. You find that kind once a decade if you're fortunate." Elias looked at him. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. 3 weeks later, Booker's Auto had more work scheduled than it had seen in 2 years. Not because of the scandal, but because the public correction had included a full account of the Carver-Macon findings, and the engineering community, smaller than the general public and carrying a longer memory, had received the news with the particular relief of an injustice being named after too many years without a name. Former colleagues had called. 2 had sent referrals. 1 had driven 4 hours to have his transmission rebuilt by a man he felt he owed a debt to, though he did not put it that way. The bay sign had a companion now, a smaller panel, new wood, clean paint reading Booker Safety Works, a Whitcomb Dominion initiative. Elias had negotiated the name himself. He had not wanted the company's name in front of his. On a Saturday morning in mid-December, Victoria arrived alone in a plain sedan with nothing behind it. She looked different at the garage than she had in the boardroom, not smaller, but less armored. She walked the space with genuine attention, asked questions Elias had not expected her to know to ask, and listened with the patience of someone who understood she was in someone else's area of expertise. Harold had arrived an hour before her and was sitting in the waiting room in a clean wool coat, at ease in a way he had not been for weeks. When Naomi came home from a friend's house and found an old man she didn't know drinking coffee in her father's garage, she looked at him with the frank assessment of a 10-year-old and asked what his job was. Harold said he used to drive trucks. She said that was pretty good and went to find her father. Elias was in the bay, under the flathead diesel he had been restoring since October, when Naomi appeared beside the lift and asked if they were rich now. He rolled out, looked up at her, and smiled in the easy way of a man who has put something down that he carried for a long time. He said they weren't rich in the way she probably meant. But they were something better. They didn't owe anyone a debt of silence anymore. Nobody could hold a story over their heads. Nobody could use the past as a door they could not walk through. Naomi considered this with the seriousness of someone not quite old enough to understand it fully and old enough to know it mattered. She went back inside. When Elias rolled up the garage door the next morning at first light, the cold coming in off the county road, the sky that particular deep blue that arrives just before the sun does, he paused for a moment in the opening. 3 weeks ago, a dawn had brought 12 black vehicles and the start of something he had not chosen and could not have foreseen. This dawn brought a schedule board full of appointments and the quiet sound of a town beginning its day around a garage that was, once again, exactly what it had always been, a place where broken things came to be made right. Elias Booker had not saved Harold Whitcomb because he knew what the old man was worth. He had saved him because it was what a decent man does when someone is on the ground and nobody else will stop. And that decency, unhurried, uncalculating, the kind that costs something real, had returned to him everything that fear and power had spent years trying to take away.
Brother. No, that's the wrong way. Go around this way. Let's do it. All right, welcome in, chat. How's everyone doing today? Let's get it. You been enjoying Crimson Desert though, bro? Oh, I love getting that. Getting the perfect dodge is so nice. How's the audio sound, guys? How's it sound for you? Getting the perfect dodge is so nice. Should I turn the game audio up or is it okay? You let me know. Oh wow, I definitely dodged that.